Thank you, Mary. So hopefully you can see the presentation screen. Nobody's saying no, so I'm assuming that that's okay.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Very, very good. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is take you on a bit of a voyage from when I first began recording anything, right up to the present. And as it says in the title, that we advertise this meeting with, it's not entirely about plants. And I'm going to have the same issue. Right. So my recording began many, many years ago at primary school, when we had to produce books of pressed flowers, with a bit of help from my mum. That there are some records, and some of these I have transcribed, and they're now in the BSBI's database. But as a small boy, flowers are probably not the primary interest, although collecting things definitely was. And so Brook Bond Tea produced picture cards that you could collect. And here was a set of particular wildflowers. What I was really interested in, though, it was trains and collecting train numbers. And I had the Train Spotters book with all the numbers, and you underlined the train that you'd spotted. And the same with buses. Collecting bus numbers was a great passion as a primary school pupil. And I even went as far as getting a pass that would allow me into the Crossville depot in Wrexham. And another main interest came when my parents moved to what was the old rectory in Doddleston, and my bedroom happened to be the closest room to where the church was, and the church had a ring of bells. These are not actually Doddleston bells, these are St. Benet's bells in Cambridge. But bell ringing has really been a lifetime passion. Again, you record where you've rung, and there is a book for bell ringers, which is also available online, that records all the churches and places with bells. And I've only visited just over 2,800 of a total of over 7,000. So I've still got some way to go to get them all. But I have visited a few interesting locations, and one was in the Falkland Islands. This is Stanley Cathedral, where I've rung the bells. I've also done some recording in the Falklands, and this was probably the tastiest of the plants that are recorded, which they call the native strawberry. But as you can see, it's actually a member of the rubus family. And it's a really delicate taste to the berries. I've also found some invasive or potentially invasive non-native species in the Falklands. And this was buckthorn plantain, Plantago coronopus, which I found on a road verge. And I emailed the expert saying that I think I found this. And he said, no, you're confusing it with the native plantain. And I then sent him a picture showing what I'd found. And he said, oh, yes, that is definitely Plantago coronopus. And probably the military brought it in on their vehicle tyres. Moving further south to Antarctica, botanical recording is quite straightforward because there's only two species that are native. There's this one, Colobanthus chitensis, which is a little pearlwort, and also a grass, Disjampsia antarctica, which is a very small member of the Disjampsia family. My last trip to Antarctica took me via Cape Town, which has a detached bell tower. But although I didn't do any recording there, I was able to see a few of the plants there. So the fine-boss flora in particular, with some of their spectacular flowering forms. Also a visit to New Zealand, to Christchurch, this was one cathedral I wasn't able to ring in at all because the earthquake had totally destroyed the tower. But I did ring at other places in New Zealand. And while I was there, I was delighted to find this little plant, which I fear is off the top of my page. It's a campion, a Silene family, and a catchfly, which hasn't been seen in my own county since 2003, but was growing as a weed in one of the churchyards that I visited. And the main place where I ring the bells is St Benet's Church in Cambridge. And one of the attractions of churches and churchyards is that there is always something to find and record in the churchyard itself. So in this particular one, Campanula carpatica was growing on a chest tomb to the right of the church porch, which I'd spotted before it was officially reported, but never reported it myself. So I didn't get the credit for seeing it, which just shows how really important it is to report your records to the county recorders. Now, bell ringing is based on patterns, and that can be quite mathematical. This is one on 6 bells, where pairs of bells swap over, forming a fairly complex picture. And to ring all the possible changes on different numbers of bells is something of a mathematical exercise, so that on 6 bells, you can ring 720 different changes, and that's 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6. And that takes 25 minutes or so to perform. On 7 bells, it's 5,040 changes, which takes about 3 hours. And by bell ringers, that's regarded as a full peal if you complete one of those. People have rung a full peal of major, but so far nobody's managed to have the determination to ring bells continuously for 9 days or longer that it would take some of the higher numbers to come round in. So I've rung on a number of different bells, and I've rung quite a lot of peals, even more quarters. And these performances are all recorded in my diaries and in the bell ringers journal, The Ringing World. Cricket is very much a thing of records, and I'm very much an amateur cricketer. These days, I don't play very much, but I do continue to umpire some of the matches. And statistics is a very big part of cricket, so you have to keep all the details of your innings and everything. And I was the team statistician, and one year I did manage to top the batting average, which I claimed wasn't a fix, but it was achieved by managing to get not out in quite a few innings, which boosts your average considerably. I'm also known as an amateur astronomer, and with a bit of luck, this will show you the sun rotating around, and on the surface you can see a number of sunspots. The number changes over days and months and years. And one of the things I try and record every day is the number of sunspots. This happens even when I'm in Antarctica, as I am here. That little telescope is traveled to the ends of the world with me, and I still use it on a daily basis. The number of sunspots you see goes up and down in a semi-regular period of about 11 years, with some years having a very high maximum, and other years, like the last cycle, having a much lower maximum. Sometimes, though, there are other things on the surface of the sun. You can see a black dot just here, but that isn't a sunspot. That's the planet Venus passing in front of the sun. In the same location, I've also got the telescope projecting an image, and here you can see that the top of the image isn't circular. So this was the last partial eclipse of the sun, and usually as a part of a sort of work outreach thing, I let people know if there's something worth having a look at, and this crowd of doctoral students at BAS came out to have a look at the eclipse. As well as recording the sun, I record other suns or stars, and some of you may recognize this as the constellation of Cygnus. It is the brightest star in Cygnus Deneb, and here's the cross, or the Northern Cross as it's sometimes referred to. But there's a star here that you don't normally see, and that's a nova or new star, which erupted in the 1970s, brightening from total invisibility to being a bright naked eye object and then fading away again. And you can see my name is listed here as being one of the observers who reported estimates of how bright it was. More recently, another star appeared, again, a nova, a new star. And again, I made observations and contributed it to the British Astronomical Association. This is the constellation of Ursa Major, or the Great Bear, or the Plough as it's sometimes known. And here's the handle of the plough, and here's the bowl of the plough. And there are a number of variable stars associated with it. There's one just about here, and that behaves in a semi-regular fashion where the amplitude of variation changes slowly over time. So at the current moment, it's brightening and fading by really quite a huge amount. Other stars are much more regular in behavior, and this particular one brightens and fades over a period of about a year. Also in the astronomical field, I'm the director, or sorry, I was the director of the British Astronomical Association's Comets section, and I'm now the visual observations coordinator. So when there are comets around, I do try and make observations of them. And there is one moderately bright comet that's visible in binoculars at the moment, which is 12P Pons Brooks. That might be more obvious later this month than next month, but is probably not going to be that easy to spot with the naked eye. And I've been observing comets for many years. This was the first comet I actually saw, Comet Kohoutek, which got exaggerated press coverage by saying it was going to be brighter than the planet Venus and would be spectacularly obvious in the sky. In the end, it wasn't spectacularly obvious, but it was quite a nice comet with a short tail to it. I was lucky enough to, I would say, arrange a trip to Antarctica when Halley's Comet was around, and was able to be the first person to observe the comet from Antarctica. And here's an image of that new comet, Comet Pons Brooks. The modern imaging is astonishingly sensitive. So although this shows a long tail behind the comet, almost certainly you would not be able to see that with the unaided eye. And mostly what I use is a pair of 20 by 80 binoculars, and you can see a few plants in my back garden. On the left, there's one of the invasive species, Ara metallicum, which my neighbour planted in her garden and has now donated to me, and it's spreading away. And then on the right here, I have a little bed of arable weeds, and a lot of that greenery is due to shepherd's needle, Scandex pectenveneris, which is doing quite happily in its little habitat there. This is just trying to predict what comets will do in the future. So this is that bright comet, or relatively bright comet's Pons Brook, which might get to be just about visible with the naked eye in early April. More excitingly is a comet that might be visible next October, which could be as bright as the planet Jupiter, which is visible in the evening sky at the moment. Now, it's always unwise to predict how bright things will be in the future, but at the moment, this comet is on track to be really quite a potentially spectacular object next autumn. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that that's what it turns into. And this is roughly where you can see it in the middle of October. Here in the evening sky, in the southwest. Initially, it'll be hampered by a rather bright moon, but it should be fairly easy to see, and I'm sure the media will be telling us all about it before too long. This is just another alternative view showing it's relatively low down, and here, if you've got really dark skies, you might see the Milky Way arching overhead. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to replicate a couple of other comets that I've imaged over Cambridge. This is the dome that houses one of the big telescopes at the observatories, and I imaged using an ordinary camera with slide film comet Hale-Bopp in the 1990s, and various other things since then. So moving on to my professional career, where again, recording what you see is really important. This is the instrument that measures ozone, and this is me on my last visit to Antarctica, using it outside. Normally it would be inside a rather better heated hut rather than being out on the surface of the floating ice shelf. And it was observations with an instrument like that that led to the discovery of the Antarctic ozone hole. This last Antarctic Springs ozone hole was another very big and deep one. And indeed, over the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen a sequence of very deep and large ozone holes. The amount of ozone destroying substances in the atmosphere is definitely going down. So the question is, why is the ozone hole not recovering quite as rapidly as it had been? It might be a link into climate change, which is perhaps cooling the upper atmosphere where the ozone is. Or more recently, it might possibly be due to the big volcanic eruption that occurred at Tonga last year. We also have climate measurements made in Antarctica, and this is one of the many automatic weather stations, although as you can see, this is near our main staff station. And one of the other fun things you do is to get to release weather balloons, and these allow us to monitor the climate not just at the surface, but up to heights up to maybe 20 kilometers or so, and see how the atmosphere is changing at various different levels. Closer to home, that dome that I showed you the picture of, I've been using a very simple maximum minimum thermometer since the 1970s to record the weekly temperatures there. And even on that fairly coarse scale, it's obvious that the climate of Cambridge has changed significantly, particularly the mean minimum temperature for any week has gone up rather more than the mean maximum temperature. However, even with climate warming as a general thing, there are the occasional cold snap, and I was delighted to be able to go skating on what was St. John's skating rink in the 19th century, but only very rarely freezes over to a sufficient thickness to allow you to actually get out on it. So that was a very nice thing for December, not this last year, but the year before. Another thing that I do a lot of recording for, and which creates what Mark Hill calls the Shanklin effect, which has to be compensated for, is recording liverworts. Now, most bryophyte recorders will do liverworts and mosses, and so you can judge recorder effort by a combination of the two. But my predilection is only for recording liverworts, although I do occasionally record the odd moss. And this biases the statistics quite significantly. I also record ladybirds, and the map shows where some of my records of the 7-spot ladybird have been made. But sometimes you see spectacular numbers of ladybirds, and the image was actually made showing a bryophyte excursion to Hertfordshire. So moving on to plant recording, because this is, after all, the England annual meeting of the BSBI. I do record outside of England, particularly around Flintshire, and this map is a MapMate one showing where I've recorded in Flintshire post 2020. So those are all new Atlas record or post Atlas records. But so far, they haven't got into the BSBI's database because their records haven't been transferred from the North Wales Record Centre, COVNOD, into the database. One of the attractions of recording outside your own county is that you get habitats that you just don't have at all. So Cambridgeshire, for example, has one heather plant. But the Welsh or the North Wales moorlands have wide expanses of heather and bracken and so on. Another plant that's extinct in Cambridgeshire, Melanpyrum pratense. My mother recorded it on a mountain near where my sister still lives, and I was delighted to be able to re-find it fairly recently. Other things that are extinct in my home county are things like the bog asphodel, and there you can see some heather in the background. A different habitat that occurs is the coastal habitat, and on one occasion I was recording along the Dee estuary and noticed in the distance that something odd was happening. And this wave of water came rolling up the estuary. This is the Dee bore, a fairly small one in this occasion, but really quite an astonishing effect. After the bore had gone through, what was quite remarkable was how rapidly the water level rose behind it. And indeed, recording a bit later, the tide had risen to such a height that I got my feet slightly wet returning to where the mainland was. I also do quite a lot of recording in Shropshire, and this gives something of an idea of the parts of the county I've visited. This in part is due to the encouragement from the Shropshire Environmental Data Network, who make certain that I go out recording as much as possible. And again, there are habitats that simply don't occur in Cambridgeshire, and the rise from the bottom of that valley to the top of the hill is probably more than the entire topography variation in Cambridgeshire. And there are other things that are potentially rare in my county. So being able to see some of the species of really wet grassland like these. So toothwort, I think this was possibly one of the few occasions when I've ever seen the plant, a really spectacular hemiparasite. And on the border between Shropshire and Denbighshire, Andromeda polyfolia, the bog rosemary, a really pretty little plant. But returning closer to home, Cambridgeshire is pretty well recorded, although you can see that even in the fens, not 100% coverage by any means. And that's despite the very high recording activity that was done for the fenland flora, which we'll be hearing about at the next BSBI winter talk. The BSBI database has a number of useful facilities under the My County tab, and this shows where recording effort has taken place since 2013. And you can see the recorder effect, that the bright green area down here is Cambridge, and there are quite a few recorders in Cambridge, and so this is far better covered than some of the places further north. And this is something that's always worth being aware of, that you sometimes really have to force yourself to go away from your own centre recording to visit some of the less well frequented pieces. There's another page on the DDB that shows taxa not refound since 2010. And here it looks like some of the marginal areas are really quite badly recorded. But in part, this is because they include species that have not been refound in the entire 10 kilometre squares, rather than just in the bit that belongs to your county. So by and large, they're not quite as badly recorded as they're shown there. And I modified the query bit to show just what was in my own county. And that does change the picture, but it also shows that I need to visit this little tiny tip of Cambridgeshire, which is actually one of our few acidic areas. So that might well be worth visiting rather more. And then a few of the bits up in the fenland, again, need a bit more visiting. And DDB has a more detailed list that gives you a bit of a breakdown of where it might be particularly useful to go. And generally, most of the Cambridgeshire hectads do have at least over 70% of species refound, but there are some where it doesn't quite meet that standard. As well as using the DDB, I use QGIS to produce a different sort of map. And this particular one shows recording post-Atlas. And there's certainly plenty of areas that haven't had post-Atlas visits yet. You can also see that I've concentrated on a few particular areas. And this strip here between Chatteris and Ely is the ooze washes, and then up here between Peterborough and Wisbech are the Nen washes, or Neen washes, depending on what you want to call it. And those are amongst the most biodiverse areas of the county. And this northern tip gets a lot of visit here north of Wisbech. And that's because this is the only Cambridgeshire bit of seaside. The banks of the tidal Nene up there do give us native seaside plants, such as the one I've shown here, Buplerium tenuissimum, the slender hare's ear. And there's still at least 2 or 3 plants of that surviving amongst the extensive elytrigia of the washes. There are always new plants coming in, and this was essentially a country park near Cambridge, which I used as a target for the BSBI's beginners meeting last May. And the beginners found Trifolium ornithopodioides just in this area between this patch of allotments and the lake. And so that was a complete and utter surprise not something that had been expected to find, and still things turn up. Another area where the university is creating a new site. Down here, there's a new lake with a walkway around it, which is accessible. Further up, there's one that is much less accessible, but which you can stray into. And I did, and I found this really weird looking grass, which Alan Leslie was eventually able to track down and gave it this name, Beckmania syzygackney, or American slowgrass. And that there was a first county record for that. So again, going to look in odd bits of habitat can produce unusual things. So this just is a repeat of the QGIS map, but using MapMate, and shows some of the same features. And as I said, the ooze washes are highly species rich. And so we have an extensive population of Siam latifolium, greater water parsnip in them. I've used here a slightly different mapping, and here I've only plotted those species which occur on my county register of plants of conservation concern. This is the same as a rare plant register, but does include some plants that are relatively common in the county, but are threatened to a greater or lesser extent throughout England as a whole. And it really highlights how the Nen and ooze washes are really important. Also how our linear features, the Devil's Ditch, the Fleam Dyke and Roman Road, which are all relict chalk grasslands, and then Wicken Fen as well, and Cambridge City itself. Now, the Cambridge City is probably being biased by the number of botanists that can spot oddities, but nevertheless, it's interesting that the city area does show up. And to be fair, in part, that's due to some of the places nearby, like the Gogmagog Hills and the Cherry Hinton chalk pits, which do have a number of threatened plants in them. Sometimes even visiting well-known places produces oddities. And I do quite a lot of, or quite regular conservation work at one of these sites, Haslingfield Pit, which is known for its man orchid, Orchis anthropophora. And on one visit, I thought, oh, there's a mousy hawkwood, but it's got 2 flowering heads, and thought nothing much of it. And I wasn't entirely certain. And it wasn't until I went back subsequently and found it actually in flower with several flower heads that I was able to determine as the spreading mouse ear hawkweed. It's an alien species or an alien subspecies, which was known for a long time on a lawn in Cambridge, but I recently found it at a couple of other locations. So it is worth double checking your Pilosella to see what it's doing when it's in flower. Locally, we have a flora group, and we go out on various excursions during the wood, and it's a mix of interesting sites or under-recorded areas, and almost invariably something of interest comes up. And in this case, it was a couple of plants that are rare, at least in Cambridgeshire. Some of them are more common elsewhere. And so when we found one plant of Carex strigosa, the thin-spiked wood sedge, we were delighted. But nearby on a woodland ride, it was locally abundant. And yet this is only the second site for it in the county. So why in 1 or 2 places? Is it spreading? Is it just that we've missed it previously? An interesting question. Wicken Fen is one of the county's best recorded sites, but even in a well-recorded place, there are always new things. Sometimes it's the really common things because everybody's concentrated on the rarities and missed the obvious. So we made a few new monad records, and one was just finding Anagallis arvensis, Scarlet Pimpernel, in the car park. So no matter where you go, you will find plants of interest. One that is, I think, peculiar to this part of the world is Melampyrum cristatum, the crested cowwheat. And one of the Cambridgeshire sites last year, which did have a reasonably good population, I only saw one plant in flower, but it is a really spectacularly coloured flower. I did, by almost accident, visit a site in Essex with this plant, and I was recording a few under-recorded Essex monads for Ken Adams, and didn't think there was anything particularly exciting about it. And then I found this sign saying specially protected road verge. And so I thought, well, I better record that in a bit more detail. And so I did, and couldn't at the time think of any reason why it might be specially protected. It didn't seem to have anything ever so unusual on it. And then a bit later in the day, I was walking past a cottage with my clipboard in hand, and the chap came out and said, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm recording wildflowers." "Oh," he said, do you know about our specially protected road verge?" And I said, "Yeah, I passed one earlier in the day." And he said, "Well, that's got crested cowwheat on it." I said, "Oh, well, thanks very much." So he said it flowered magnificently during COVID, but sadly, since then, it looks like the road verge has been neglected with lack of management, and it certainly hadn't been cut over the winter. So how the cowwheat will do there, I'm not certain. One of the things I go to, and I'll blame this on Alex Lockton, who is Vice County Recorder for Shropshire, and I had a habit of visiting some Shropshire monads that had no records, so he decided to call those Shanklins. And Cambridgeshire has still got a number of them, and it has been quite fascinating visiting some of them and seeing what you get. So one of the ones that I visited, I found Eleugeton fluitans, which is quite a rare plant with us. Another one on the way to the Shanklin, I found this patch of Sambucus ebulus dwarf elder, which had never been reported previously in that part of the county. So really quite amazing what part chance plays in recording. And if you just, instead of saying places with no records, places with fewer, or monads with fewer than 50 records, there are actually quite an enormous number in the county. And so almost certainly some of those will have interesting plants growing in them, which need targeting. And just as a footnote to the question of Shanklins, I met up with my sister and my brother and his wife last weekend, and we had Sunday lunch on the border between Cheshire and Shropshire, and my brother wanted to go for an after lunch walk. So I suggested, well, there's a Shanklin near here. Why don't we go and record that? So the four of us duly did go to this small fragment of a Shanklin in Shropshire and made records for it. And I'm just in the process of typing those records up now. Another thing that I introduced as chair of the Committee for England was the concept of lost rarities in England, and going searching for these has been quite fascinating as well. Sometimes you go looking for one plant and you find something completely different. which was also a law plant, but not expected to be where I found it. Other times you discover the habitat is completely gone and there's no chance whatsoever of re-finding it. Other times the habitat and the plant are still there doing very nicely. It's just that nobody for some reason has bothered reporting them. So one thing that, because of the rather too many roles that I take on for BSBI, it would be really good to have a law coordinator and to try and push this concept on a bit further. Sometimes you make law discoveries by accident, and this was one that our local Natural History Society excursion came across, Bromus arvensis, and the textbooks say that it has erect panicles or erect florets, and yet in life the florets are clearly quite drooping. And the reason for this became obvious when I laid the plant down flat. When it's on a herbarium sheet, they are indeed erect, but in life they are quite drooping. And then as a sort of precursor to what I might be doing next year, and that's looking at important arable plant areas. Cambridgeshire has a few areas that are particularly notable with a high density of arable species. Some it's accidental, so at least in one case it's due to me having shepherd's needle in my garden, but others, they are genuinely important sites. Overall, though, there is still plenty of recording to do, even in the designated sites. And for a variety of reasons, these may be under-recorded. And so it can be quite important to look at perhaps some of the less interesting parts of some of these sites with a significant designation, either as a triple SI or a local wildlife site. And one thing, at least from my own county, is that we've got a long way to go yet before the objective of 30 by 30, i.e. 30% of the land managed for nature by 2030. And I do hope that the local nature recovery strategy work will go a long way towards meeting that objective. So where do I record? Well, this is where the DDB tells me that I've recorded, which is an alarmingly large part of eastern, central and northern England. This is on a hectare scale. There's a few spots in Ireland. I don't think it's a complete record of where I've recorded, because there are, for a variety of reasons, records that don't get from the local record centre or the local VCR into the database. But it shows that Cambridge is my main place where I do an awful lot of recording, but quite a lot of scattered recording elsewhere. And it's certainly been very enjoyable visiting many of these places, just seeing the sheer variety of plants that grow in England. So my most recent unexpected find was on the doorstep, and this was stinking hawksbeard, Crepis foetida, which didn't smell particularly badly when I first found it, but it did smell later. And you'll have seen the report about the discovery of this in BSBI News for this month.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that fascinating talk. When you went through what I record, I didn't think we're going to cover, as well as the wild plants, that we'd have, let's say, bell ringing, cricket, sunspots, comets. Yeah, pretty wide ranging, and the areas as well as the huge area of Britain you've covered. I think you must have covered more monads than anybody else, or these hectads. There's also, you've been in the Falklands, Antarctica, via South Africa, New Zealand. So very, very wide ranging, very interesting talk. Thank you. And yes, okay, ending up with a bit of an alarming, huge way to go to get to 30 by 30. And especially that some of the supposedly SSSIs and local wildlife sites not very well recorded. Having a look at, there were one or two questions had come in. Let me just have a look. Well, somebody had already asked, actually, how will the proposed new developments in your area impact on key botanical sites? So I don't know if this is someone who knows about developments in Cambridgeshire, or just a more general question about, are there any proposed developments that you know will impact on any of these SSSIs or local wildlife sites?
Yes, there are always proposals for development. Not only in England, it applies to Wales and Scotland and Ireland, where it's almost a continual fight to restrain the development particularly on fragile sites. And so I think what often isn't understood by the public is, just by being there, it's very difficult to maintain the integrity of a site. So you, your dog, all have footprints, and those footprints make a big difference to some of the fragile species that grow in some of our precious sites. And so sometimes we have to be excluded just to let nature have its place. And that is a very difficult thing for people to agree to, almost. But sometimes a development has no direct impact on the botany, but it may impact other species. And that's often the case as well. So just because there's no botanical problem with the development, that doesn't mean it won't affect the birds and the bees and the miscellaneous invertebrates and the fungi. And so the botany, if you like, is a very visible sign of what's going on, but there are many other things. So yes, development is not helpful for a lot of things. And what we should really be concentrating on is putting the development in the places where it will do the least damage.
Yeah. A question from Robin Blades come up in the Q&A. Does this talk show that the BSBI should be trying to recruit people who like recording things and make them interested in plants, rather than getting people who already like plants to record?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And it's probably one that events and communications should consider, because we are looking at ways of getting out to new audiences. So by going to some of those, if you like, societies that make records but in a completely different area, we might well gain new recruits to botany. So that's a very worthwhile thing, and I'll make a note of that to ENC.
I say it is in the Q&A, Jonathan. Yeah. Yes, and it's certainly something to debate and discuss, isn't it? Well, thank you for that question. See if there's any other questions appeared. We've had some people thanking us for an enjoyable afternoon and interesting talks. Yes, and a thank you to you with a talk with a variety of subjects in it, Jonathan. One thing that I was interested in and how it might impact on plants in the future, you showed the graphs showing the mean maximum temperatures and the mean minimum temperatures and what they'd done in Cambridge, and showed a greater increase in the mean minimum temperature as opposed to although there was an increase in the maximum, it was actually appeared to be a shallower increase. What sort of impact do you think that might have on species in the future?
Well, I think we're already seeing some of the impacts because things like nettles and thistles are not being killed off to the same extent that they would have been when we had really hard frosts in the past. Many grasses are almost at the stage where they're now keeping growing throughout the winter, whereas some of the more fragile flowering plants don't. They have to grow from seed if they're an annual or whatever. So my suspicion is that the changing minimum temperatures will be having a negative impact on a lot of our native flora, and that may be one of the drivers for some of the species that Geoffrey mentioned in his talk.
Yes, and there's probably quite a big difference. Obviously, I'm in the north, I'm on Merseyside, but again, West Coast, a fairly mild climate. I mean, obviously, some places like more up in the Pennines, up in the northeast, may still be getting colder winter. Well, they will have colder winters.
Yeah, I think where I'm in Cambridgeshire, it's definitely by and large a colder mean temperature than where my sister lives up in the sort of Cheshire, Flintshire border area. And so when I was up there last week, there were quite a few species that were already in flower, which are not in flower in Cambridgeshire. And that's another thing that's changing. The lack of frosts is meaning that some things, if they have a mind to, will flower much earlier. So there was cow parsley, for example, already in flower.
Right. Yeah. And we've had another question from Carol Wilson. Jonathan, do you have special dispensation to have more hours in your days to do all of the things you do? Very interesting talk, thank you. And I think all of us really admire the amount of things you get through in your voluntary activities for BSBI.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I do it is that most of it is quite good fun. And if I'm doing things for other people as well, that adds to the enjoyment. So I'm glad everybody has found this afternoon an enjoyable experience.